everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you very much. So thank you very much for coming to the session. Thank you, Marcos, wherever there, for your very kind introduction. My sincere gratitude also goes to the organizers for putting together such a great conference. I'm honored to give a plenary at this anniversary JALT conference, and I feel very excited about talking about the topic that I feel passionate about, task-based language teaching. So today, we're going to focus on task-based design principles and explore how they can be put into practice. So, what do you think this number represents? Well, it's the number of foreign visitors to Japan in August 2025, just in 1 month. It's increased by 17% from the previous year, reaching a record high. So this picture was taken just last week in Kyoto, and you might recognize the person in the middle. It's me, dressed up not for Halloween, but for this very important historical parade in Kyoto. And in the background, you see a lot of tourists, including foreign tourists. So this contemporary situation in Japan really highlights a critical need for the capacity to communicate in languages other than our first. Be that foreigners or visitors learning Japanese or us learning their languages, so that we can communicate effectively for authentic purposes to accomplish real goals. And it has important implications for language education in Japan. Learning how to communicate in English and other foreign languages is becoming a pressing need for people in Japan. The question for us, language teachers, then, is this: how can we best address this need in the language classroom? One way to deal with students' growing need to be able to communicate in a new language is to adopt TBLT, or task-based language teaching. To quote Bygate et al., TBLT is an approach to designing language educational experiences and everything that they entail, including curriculum, materials, teacher practices, and assessments. And it also involves both the use of communicative tasks within the classroom and the development of abilities to engage in meaningful language use beyond the classroom. Notice here, we put a lot of emphasis on meaning and communication, and there is a very close connection to meaningful language use in the real world outside the classroom. So if the goal of a language program is to help students become able to communicate in a new language, adapting TBLT principles seem to make a lot of sense. But the question is, what are those TBLT principles exactly? And how can they be implemented in a real language classroom? So, what I want to do today in my talk is to first introduce some selected key task-based design principles based on a handful of key sources, like these. And in particular, this very recent research synthesis project that I completed with my colleagues, where a lot of the design principles were actually shown to have clear empirical backing. I also want to demonstrate, this is very relevant to us, right? I want to demonstrate how these principles can actually be put into practice using my own classroom as an example. So first, let me introduce the context that we'll be working with today. So this was a year-long task-based business English course for business majors at a private university in Japan. And student proficiency levels ranged from intermediate to upper intermediate. The course was taught entirely in English, and the class size was approximately 30. Using widgets, so widgets is a textbook, a task-based textbook, and published by Atama eBooks. If you're interested, I highly recommend it. So if you're interested, you should definitely visit their booth today or tomorrow. Okay, so using widgets, the course simulated working at a company, and students engaged in a variety of business-related tasks, including inventing their own product ideas, which we will be focusing on today. And through a careful needs analysis, I had identified giving effective business presentations to be one of the main target tasks for my students to learn. In the first semester, students worked in groups of 4, and they came up with their own product ideas. And they refined their ideas through a customer survey. Their ideas included such creative ideas like a pen TV that lets you watch TV on a large screen anywhere, and an automatic carry case, a hands-free carry-on that follows you. And as a final project, they also gave a group presentation about their own invention. And at the very end of the semester, they voted to choose the best 4 product ideas out of 8 that we had. In the second semester then, which will be the main focus of my talk today, students worked further on the selected best 4 product ideas. Now, teams whose ideas were selected among the best were split into 2 groups, and they welcomed 2 new members. As a new group, they were asked to make unique changes to the original idea. And again, as a final project, they were expected to give a group presentation about their final product idea. Recall here that giving a presentation was one of the main target tasks for my students to learn. So when we think about target tasks, the kinds of tasks that we or our students would have to do in the real world, they actually require a variety of skills. And giving an effective presentation is no exception, right? So for students to be able to give an effective presentation, they have to learn to design effective visuals with easy to understand contents and a clear and logical organization. They also need to learn how to deliver their presentation effectively. And oftentimes, there is a Q&A or question and answer session following the presentation. In the first semester, we focused on the content of the presentation and also effective delivery. So my students actually did fairly well on the presentation per se in the first semester. But what I noticed was they really struggled with the Q&A session following the presentation. And their challenges seemed to include the following. So students were not used to answer questions on the spot, even in Japanese, they told me. And they couldn't understand the questions sometimes. They hadn't anticipated the question, so even if they understood the question, they didn't really know what to say. And they knew what they wanted to say sometimes, but they didn't know how to do that in English. Given all of those challenges my students faced in the first semester, what I wanted to do in the second semester was to help my students improve their Q&A performance. The question here then is, the main question for today, is how can we design pedagogic tasks to support student learning? To answer this question, let's take a look at a series of design principles based on which we can create effective pedagogic tasks. So we'll start with the first one. From a task-based perspective, it is important to orient learners to what they will be using the language to do. So first, we want to generate learners' initial interest in the task and help them focus on meaning and identify their own learning needs. Well, what can we do? So the very first pedagogic task I had my students do was to watch a video of a model product presentation, including the Q&A session. And I had them answer some comprehension questions about the video that they just watched. We then focused on the Q&A session, and I had my students compare 2 example Q&A performances. And they had to analyze those examples to think about what actually makes a good task performance. So here, each of these pedagogic steps illustrates task-based design principles. For example, we can help students understand task expectations more readily by having them watch a model. Or we can help students focus on meaning by asking comprehension questions. And discovery learning is another example here. So by giving students an opportunity to analyze model task performances, we can give them an opportunity to really think, what does this task entail? How should we approach this task? And in my class, actually, this discussion led us to collectively design assessment rubrics later on. So here, what we should keep in mind is, a lot can be accomplished through having students analyze model task performances at this very initial stage of task instruction. Now, let's move on. To promote effective learning, start with cognitively simple tasks and gradually increase complexity to approximate real-world demands. So next, we want to help students develop the knowledge and skills needed for successful task performance, but in a step-by-step manner. So what should come first? In our case, we started with the listening task because students needed to be able to comprehend the questions first before they could answer them. So I had my students fill out a chart while I read aloud a list of questions, typical of the kind of Q&A that they would experience. And here, starting with this task made sense procedurally, but it also made sense from cognitive perspectives. So what we know from research is that pedagogic tasks are most effective, right, when sequenced from simple to complex. And input-based tasks are generally cognitively less demanding. So starting with a relatively simple input-based task here provided a good foundation for more challenging speaking tasks to come. And the questions that I read aloud, they were also sequenced intentionally to increase in its complexity. We started with less complex sentences to give students an opportunity to get used to this task type and the procedures so that they can focus on comprehension. Here, notice that complexity of the sentences was manipulated by linguistic demands, so including things like sentence length and vocabulary frequency. So here, if you look at the 10 questions, the sentences get longer and longer, and they also become, syntactically more complex. And words, less frequency words, like warranty, are introduced gradually. And the chart, the advanced organizer that I designed for this task, also had an important role to play. So here, while they were listening to me reading aloud the questions, students needed to jot down the main question word and also the main content word, like these. So this advanced organizer provided the kind of scaffolding and support that the students needed to learn, to develop the ability to comprehend the questions. And we know from research findings that scaffolding reduces cognitive task complexity, which in turn helps them focus on comprehension. After we went through the first 5 questions, we then went on to discuss strategies to use if they couldn't catch the question. And then we continued with the list. It was actually really interesting to see my students using those strategies readily while we worked on the remaining 5 questions. Now let's move on to the next design principle. So task-based instruction isn't about simply teaching learners how to get by. It's important to draw their attention to language forms, but always in a communicative context. So what strategies can we use to help students focus on form? So the next step for my students had to do with being able to actually answer the questions that they comprehended correctly. So the goal here was to help students develop their ability to deliver effective responses during the Q&A with a focus on language form. To this end, I had my students write down answers to a series of questions about their product idea. So here, they had some time to plan their responses. Planning time, we know from research findings, reduces task complexity, which in turn helps students focus on different aspects of their language production, including syntactic complexity, so how complex their production is, accuracy, how accurately can they use grammar, and also fluency, how smoothly can they talk without pausing too much. Importantly, what our recent meta-analysis showed was sufficient time is actually needed to benefit from planning, at least 10 minutes as indicated by many of the studies. Additionally, in the first semester, I noticed that my students' answers were quite simple. So if they were asked a yes-no question, they would just say yes or no, if they could actually answer the question. So in the second semester, I wanted to push them a little bit more. So I gave them simple task instructions, extra task instructions, which read, avoid just saying yes or no, even to a yes-no question. Make sure you add a sentence to elaborate. And they were given 2 examples. Research shows that simple instructions like these can actually make a difference and help students focus on a particular aspect of their language production and focus on form. Now, interaction lies at the heart of task-based instruction, even though TBLT goes beyond simple interaction and collaboration. How can we encourage effective learner-learner interaction? So in task 3, students answered the Q&A questions individually. So subsequently, I had my students exchange ideas with their group members. And then students practiced answering and asking and answering questions with a partner. So this was an interactive task that I introduced. We then reviewed strategies for when they missed a question and discussed strategies for when they didn't know an answer, which is an important skill to have. We know from research findings that interaction is crucial. Interaction is a critical condition for successful second language acquisition. So giving students an opportunity to interact, like asking and answering questions with a partner, is important. But a task like this, depending on the students' proficiency levels, can be monotonous and boring sometimes, because students typically read just off the script. So I wanted to push my students a little bit more and make the task or interaction a little bit more authentic. Now, in TBLT, we gradually build learners' abilities and confidence to perform the target task independently. So next, we want to scaffold learners' development towards successful real-world performance under more authentic conditions. What can we do? So through this task, what I wanted to do was to have my students practice asking and answering questions, but in a more authentic scenario. Remember, 2 groups were now working on the same original product idea. So I portrayed them as business competitors. Each student was paired up with another student from their competitor group, and they were told that their job is to spy on the other team's improvements. Ask as many questions as possible to find out what their product is like. In this scenario, my students loved it. And it really created meaningful information gap, right? Which encouraged more authentic and real and motivating interaction between the students. So this is how I actually set up the task. Using a poster that they had created earlier on, each student gave a 1-minute pitch about their improved product. And then they engaged in a simulated Q&A. They were told to ask at least 3 questions. And they were told 2 questions can be from the question list that we had been working with. But 1 must be something new. I wanted to include this surprise element to increase complexity so that we can approximate real-world demands. We're coming towards the end of the task cycle, so it was important to increase task complexity at this point, so that we can give students an opportunity to think about, to really learn how to deal with the challenges that they might face when they actually have to answer questions during the Q&A. And here, increasing the complexity had an added benefit of eliciting more interaction from the students. They experienced this task cycle 4 times with a different member from the competitor group. So they were repeating the same task, but every time they were working with a different partner from the competitor group. So, the interaction was still meaningful, and it was quite motivating for the students. And this task repetition is important from the research perspective as well, because it has beneficial effects on a variety of linguistic aspects, including syntactic complexity, accuracy, lexis, but especially fluency. At the end of the task cycle then, students gathered together to share information that they collected from their competitor group. They shared questions that they received and checked their answers to the new questions. They then went on to plan how to make their product more distinct from their competitors. As a homework assignment, they were also encouraged to anticipate other questions and prepare answers to those anticipated questions. Now, the last design principle. So in task-based instruction, we use different forms of assessment to gauge and guide learning. How should we assess learners at the end of this instructional cycle then? So the question that I was interested in answering at this point was this: to what extent have my students learned to do the target task of answering questions during the Q&A? So I had my students give a presentation and then engage in a live, spontaneous Q&A. The purposes of assessment here were, of course, to gauge students' mastery of the target task, but I wanted to make sure that I provide formative feedback. And to make the scenario or situation a little bit more authentic, I also invited an external business person who ended up asking, lots of spontaneous questions, which was fun for the students, I thought. To assess my students' performance, I used assessment rubrics that we had created earlier on collectively as a class, which basically featured the 3 aspects that my students had been working on throughout the semester. Comprehension. So, to what extent can you understand the questions asked? Readiness. How quickly can you provide an answer? And the quality of answers. To what extent can you elaborate on your answer? Based on these assessment rubrics, students received scores and feedback from the teacher, me. They also received feedback from peers and the guest. And they also reflected on their own performance using the assessment rubrics. As demonstrated here, assessment rubrics can help learners focus on what matters in task performance and get targeted feedback. So, in task-based language assessment, begin and end a task-based instructional cycle with real-world tasks that matter to students. And it's also important to use authentic performance assessment because it helps us show to the students that language is actually being learned for real communication purposes. So how well do you think my students did? Well, in general, the students' performance improved considerably. But in particular, my students were able to avoid silence by asking for repetition if they couldn't understand the question, or by providing answers right away. Another striking improvement had to do with the quality of answers. So students were able to give elaborated answers even to a yes-no question this time. So this is how I adapted the selected key task-based design principles to address the kinds of challenges that my students needed to overcome to be able to achieve the target task of giving a presentation. And here, of course, what I was able to show you today was just a part of a bigger target task of giving a presentation. And I also adapted TBLT to teach other important target tasks in this course as well. So in closing, I want to share some of the comments that my students wrote at the end of the semester. So we'll first take a look at comments students wrote about the target task of giving a presentation. So in their comments, they expressed competence and confidence in the target task. For example, one student said, final presentation was difficult, but I had a feeling of accomplishment. They had to write everything in English, so there's grammar mistakes and whatnot, but that's not what's important here, right? Another student said, it was very interesting to make better presentation by cooperating with my group members. And another comment, the last comment had to do with the Q&A session specifically. So this student said the Q&A session was not so difficult because it was easy to expect what will be asked. More generally, students also found TBLT lessons sometimes challenging, but useful and fun. So one student said, I thought this course was difficult for me, but I could learn a lot of things which were very useful. Another one said, this course is not easy, but group work was very fun, and I understood how important teamwork is. Students also seem to recognize the relevance of what we do in the classroom to their real-world needs. So one student said, in this course, I think I can acquire skills which are very important when I get a job, and I was very happy to see this comment, as you can imagine. Another one said, I think that the contents of the class are likely to be utilized on a daily basis. Students also expressed their appreciation for the focus on communication in general. So the comment we have here says, I learned how interesting communicating with my friends in English is, and I got used to using English. So I hope all of those comments illustrate from the student's perspective the effectiveness of adopting task-based language teaching approach, including the kinds of principles that I talked about today. So to recap, to design meaningful L2 instruction, we should use authentic real-world tasks as the basic building blocks for syllabus, lessons, and materials design. We should scaffold learning through a series of pedagogic tasks that gradually increase in complexity. We should also create plenty of opportunities to focus on meaning and meaning-making, while taking advantage of activities that help draw learners' attention to language forms in context. It's also important to create repeated opportunities for students to experience and practice communicative language use required for task accomplishment. And lastly, about assessment, use authentic performance assessment to gauge students' achievement in the target tasks that matter to them. So I hope now you have a better idea about what task-based design principles are and how they can actually be implemented in the classroom. Thank you very much.